Hello, everybody, and welcome to a live Edge Functions AMA as part of the Moar Serverless event. We are Netlify, not Netlify itself, I guess. If you saw the beginning of Moar Serverless today, you know me. My name is Salma Alam-Naylor. I'm a staff developer experience engineer at Netlify, and I am joined here by Eduardo Bouças, who will tell us now about himself.
Hello, everyone. Hey, Salma. My name is Eduardo. I'm a software engineer. I work at Netlify. I did a bunch of work on Edge Functions, and I'm super excited to talk about it with everyone.
Thanks for joining us. So a little bit of background. So when Edge Functions was in development, me and Eduardo had some fun times debugging some fun bugs together. And that's one of the things that I love about this job is that I get to be like right on the ground right in the crux of product development without actually having to build the product myself. But I love finding those weird bugs. That means that you people out there don't get them. So that was fun.
We bonded over bugs.
We did bond. And I think, you know what? I love that about software development. People really do bond over the absolute nonsense that is code, don't they?
Yeah.
Before we get officially started, I just want to highlight that there's a link in the description. I'm a real YouTuber now. There's a link in the description. If you want to win some Netlify keyboard swag, fill out that form in the description. Give us your details, and we will draw someone at random no later than August the 15th. So if you want some swag, link, description, form, do it. Okay, so business aside, we are here for a live AMA. So here, anyone in the chat, anyone who's coming from Moar Serverless, you can ask us anything you want about Edge Functions, as dark and deep as you want, and we will attempt to answer. And bug bonding. And so I'd like to get the ball rolling, actually. So I talk a lot about how Edge Functions is not powered by Node like traditional serverless functions, but it's powered by Dino. So Eduardo, tell everybody here, what is Dino? And do I need to learn a new language to learn Dino to use Edge Functions?
Sure. So let me start by the second part of your question. You do not need to learn a new language. Dino is just plain JavaScript and TypeScript. So Dino has first-class support for TypeScript as well. So it's not a new language. It is a new runtime for that language. So if you imagine someone who writes JavaScript for the browser to like create front-end applications, they have a set of primitives that are available to interact with the DOM and things like that. And if they decide to switch to writing stuff for the server, they'll pick something like Node, for example, and they will still have the same language, but they will have a different set of primitives available to them. They suddenly are able to like write to disk and things like that. And so the same kind of leap happens from Node to Dino. So it's the same language with a different vocabulary is the way that I like to frame it.
Like a different dialect in a language. Yeah. Nice. So why did somebody asked me this question during the Moar Serverless Q&A, but I'd like to get your opinion on it as well. So Dino sounds great. Don't need to learn any new languages, just straight up web APIs, just JavaScript. But can you tell us some of the reasons that we chose Dino to power Edge Functions instead of Node?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So some of those reasons are technical. Dino is a more recent runtime than Node, and it was built from the ground up with a set of goals in mind and with a set of constraints. And one of those goals is performance and the ability to work in a distributed setup. And so performance becomes really key when we're talking about running functions at the beginning of your request chain that will potentially run for every single request that hits your site. And so it becomes critical to be able to start the function and finish the computation in a very short period of time. And with Node, we're able to spin up an environment that is ready to invoke your code in a fraction of the time that you would typically need in a Node environment. And that's just because of the way that the runtime was built, because it was built with this specific use case in mind. There are other runtimes out there that kind of have the same goal and that have similar technical directions. And so I would say that the second reason that we chose Dino is more like philosophical in the way that it aligns with how Netlify wants to contribute to the community, because Dino is built entirely on web standards. It's an open source runtime built entirely on open standards. And we felt that it was the best way to kind of move the ecosystem forward was to allow someone to create an edge function that makes sense outside of the specific context of Netlify. And so we're building with like this common and shared set of primitives that kind of are being developed in the open. So I would say that those are the kind of the two main reasons why Dino made a lot of sense for us.
Beautiful. I love it. And from my experience, when I first approached writing edge functions when it was in development, I thought, oh, this is going to be scary. I've never used Dino before. I've heard people talk about it, but I'm scared. But actually, when you get into it, it's just JavaScript, it's just TypeScript, it's just the web. And it's actually helped me learn more about those primitive web APIs because I've been using them and they haven't been abstracted out by another framework. So I've really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. We've got some questions coming in from the audience now. This one might be a little spicy one. Someone tweeted about edge functions and Wasm today. Could you go into how they are related?
Wow, that's really fresh out of the oven. So one of the things that we are exploring is the idea of running WebAssembly in Edge functions. And there's actually a link, and I believe that's the tweet that you're referring to, Salma. I think there's a tweet of someone actually showing how that looks like on Netlify Edge functions. And so we are, because of the way that Dino, it is possible to do that with Dino today, and we support that in Edge functions. And so I think I still need to explore that myself. It's still something that is kind of very recent, but I do believe that it will enable a lot of interesting use cases. I think the whole Wasm thing is a universe of like untapped potential, and I'm really excited to see how that pans out specifically with Edge functions.
So more coming soon, I guess. It's quite exciting. It's quite exciting that Edge Functions seems to be bringing lots of different parts of the ecosystem together rather than existing separately, which is quite interesting. And who knows what the landscape will look like in like 5-10 years, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, next question from the audience, from Andrew. Aside from speed improvements, what other benefits do Edge Functions provide in terms of server-side rendering and React server components?
Okay, so I have to say that I don't know a lot about React server components. So maybe Salma, you can help me a little bit on this part. But I can tell you that one of the things that you can do with Edge functions, and I believe this is where React server components come into play, is you can stream data back to the client. So if we're talking, for example, about our serverless functions offering, you cannot stream. You need to return a finalized response. But with Edge Functions, you can actually stream data back to the client, and so that's a new capability that's made possible by Edge Functions. And I believe, I hope I'm not saying something silly here, but I believe that's what React Server Components use under the hood. So yes, that would be made possible by Edge Functions.
Now, you think that I know the answer to this, but to be honest, I haven't had chance yet to explore React Server Components because I've been so focused on like plain Edge Functions, web APIs. Like I've been using Edge Functions in projects with 0 frameworks. I actually just finished a video tutorial this week that was just no frameworks. And that's what I love about Edge Functions and this whole plain web API stuff, is that you don't need frameworks actually to do all this powerful stuff. And perhaps sometimes, no hate here, but perhaps sometimes things like React are overkill for tiny projects, and you can make use of Edge Functions and serverless functions however you need, just like icing on a cake, like sprinkles on a cake, not even icing. So yeah, interesting, definitely something to look into. Perhaps that will be my next to do. Joaquim asks, what are some limitations with Edge Functions that you think are solvable in the near future?
That's an interesting question. So I think that first of all, I would kind of maybe start by saying that I don't think that Edge Functions are necessarily a replacement for every single use case that you currently have for serverless functions. And maybe that's where we can talk about not necessarily limitations per se, but differences in or different characteristics of each of those offerings. So for example, with an Edge function, your execution, the time for that a function can run for is within the milliseconds range, whereas with a serverless function, and specifically a background function in the case of Netlify, you can go up to 15 minutes. And so if we're talking about doing like a long running job of, I don't know, just fetching, like crunching some data and producing like a sitemap or something like that, it probably makes more sense to use a serverless function. Another difference that is worth touching on is with a different runtimes, with a different runtime comes a different ecosystem of packages. And so if you have an application that heavily relies on node modules, then you might need some work in kind of converting that code, because your node modules might not work out of the box in Deno. And so again, I'm kind of hesitant to call it a limitation. It's just a different way of approaching it.
That's it. I think when I talk about the edge a lot, most people assume that it means I'm talking about putting everything on the edge forevermore and never ever considering serverless functions anymore, or even client-side JS. But I think this ecosystem is so rich, it's so complex, it's so vast, but we're also so lucky to have so many different tools to do so many different jobs. And I think that's where the art and the craftsmanship of code comes in that you choose those specific ways to get specific data or do specific things to get the most out of what you're writing and what you're building. So I think Edge Functions, it's just a tool, isn't it? It's not like the next way the web is going to be written, but it's a tool to get certain jobs done in a better way that some serverless functions can't do.
Yeah. And yeah, sorry, I was just going to add that there's also the consideration or the question of should you run absolutely everything on the edge? Like, is every single piece of dynamic code in your application, should that run on the edge? And I don't think the answer is yes for everything. Like, if you are, for example, if your application is talking to a database that lives in a specific region, the gains that you get from talking to that database from multiple locations around the world is questionable. And like, there's a ton of innovation happening in that space where you have database providers that actually give you different access points in different regions, and that's a different story. But I just wanted to just add to the point that I was trying to make earlier, that I don't think edge functions are a replacement for 100% of the use cases that it currently do in an edge, in a serverless function. Sorry.
Agreed, very much agree. So you mentioned using node modules in edge functions. And so one might think that because edge functions use Deno rather than node, you cannot use node modules in edge functions. But can you? And if so, how?
That's an interesting question. So I would say that there are like two parts to, so what does it mean to use a node module? The first one is kind of how you deliver that module. What is the kind of the package manager, package registry, whatever that you use to kind of fetch that module? And right now, there's a difference in how Node and Deno approach that. With Node, you have this kind of package.json where you interact with this tool called npm, and then you kind of fetch those modules from the centralized registry. With Deno, the approach is slightly different, where you essentially import modules from a URL. So any website can be a package registry effectively. You just import something from HTTPS, blah, 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 and then your module.javascript or .typescript. And so those are kind of the two main differences. And you can kind of work around that in some ways. You can like pull the npm module locally and then include it as part of your Deno bundle. So there are ways to work around that. So that's kind of the delivery part of it. And then the second part is the actual execution of those modules. What happens if I try to use a node module in my Deno application? And the question is, it depends, because there's a lot of things that a node module can do. If we're talking about just using native JavaScript functions, then that module will probably work, because we're still talking about the subset of like the parts of JavaScript that are common to all of the runtimes. But if you have a node module that like uses node specific APIs, so like write files to disk or like create an HTTP server, that's the part that won't work. So whether a module will work, whether a node module will work in Deno, it really depends on what the module is doing, is the best answer that I can give to that.
Is there an equivalent npm node module kind of ecosystem for Deno?
So Deno has like their own registry of packages that you can submit your package to, I believe. And then there are, I think there are like non-official tools that kind of mimic the behavior of npm and kind of package lock files and things like that. But as of right now, the Deno way does not involve a tool like npm. It involves like you actually specifying in your imports, you specify the URL that contains also the version of your module. And that's kind of an important distinction to make. So if you use a module like whatever, any node module in your application, there's going to be a version that's kind of pinned in your package.json, and any references to that module in your application will pull in that version. In Dino, you might actually have different versions of the same module in different files because the version is included in the URL that you import from.
Interesting. Thank you for that. So Brian says, I found there were generally replacements for popular node modules. Interesting. I haven't gone down the package route in Dino yet. I haven't needed to. Maybe I should start doing some more exciting stuff rather than hello world examples. So I have a very specific question here that came via the back door. So you were talking about earlier execution time of serverless functions versus edge functions, and how we're able to spin up the Dino environment quicker than a node environment on Netlify. But here's a very, very specific question. What's the difference between execution time and CPU time? And how can it be that 50 milliseconds is longer than 15 seconds?
Yeah, so another distinction in the implementation of edge functions and serverless functions is that they both have a ceiling in terms of how long your functions can run for, but that is measured differently in the two types of functions. In the case of serverless functions, they're measured in what is usually called the clock time. So we start running your code, and the clock starts ticking, and after 15 seconds, which I think, or 10 seconds, which I think is the default limit for serverless functions on Netlify, after those seconds, we basically stop the request. So that's kind of how we measure time in serverless functions. In edge functions, it is slightly different. In edge functions, that execution time is measured in actual CPU time. So what counts is how long your code is using the CPU to compute something. And where that can make a difference is that, let's say that your code makes uses a fetch call to call like an external API, and there's going to be some time that you will have to wait between like the request going out and then the response coming back in, but that time that is spent waiting is not CPU time, and so it doesn't count towards the execution limit for edge functions. And so that's kind of, that can have some, it's just how you measure the time. And like the way that you phrased the question, yes, theoretically you could have those 50 milliseconds stretch longer than 15 seconds because you might be waiting 30 seconds for like a request to come back, for example. And while you wait for that, you're not like, we stop the clock effectively.
That is something I never knew before either. So thank you. I will use that somehow in my life going forward. Okay, so we do have 5 minutes left of this live AMA. I just want to point out again, for the people who've just joined us, there is a link in the description to fill out a form to win some Netlify swag. And everyone loves a bit of swag. It's a keyboard bundle. That it's keyboard themed. I will say no more, but you can win. And the winner will be notified no later than August the 15th. So practical applications, Eduardo. People might be worried that, oh, Edge Functions is in beta, it's experimental. Should I be building production ready applications with Edge Functions? And what happens if an Edge function goes wrong? So if my Edge functions error, does my whole page error? And are there best practices for fallbacks?
Let me start by the second part, like what happens if your Edge function fails? And to answer that, I just wanted to do another segment of differences between Edge functions and serverless functions, which is where in the request chain the functions will run. In the case of serverless functions, they will typically be at the end of the request chain. A serverless function is typically responsible for terminating a request and serving a response back to the client. But an Edge function actually runs at the very beginning of the request chain, and they kind of work in this middleware pattern where they start running and then they have the power to say, I want to do something to this request. I want to modify some headers. I want to actually route it to a different place, or I want to fetch the response that would normally be served and kind of modify it before I send it along. And so they are kind of this thing that can intercept a request right at the very beginning. And in practice, this does mean that if we start running our Edge function and it fails, like there's a problem with your code, we will not be able to proceed with the rest of the request chain because the request will basically terminate right there at the very beginning. There are ways to address that. The first thing that comes to mind is the typical like error handling that you would do for any type of code. So any operation that you're doing within your Edge function, you should kind of wrap it around like error handlers and make sure that you have a graceful fallback for anything that you're doing, knowing that an error in an Edge function will kind of terminate the request. In terms of the beta and whether it's production ready, we are seeing, we actually have customers using this in production today. And we are working really hard to understand and what are the things that we're missing or the things that we could improve. And we're working hard on kind of making those things better. And so that is to say that there is still the potential for something to change in the implementation or for something to behave unexpectedly while we kind of work on those things. But you should definitely try Edge functions with a caveat of like this being still in a beta phase.
That is a perfect sentence to end the AMA on. You should definitely try Edge functions. We have loads of resources over on the Netlify blog. I'm releasing a video tutorial next week on YouTube as well to get started with no frameworks and Edge functions. And we're going to be releasing new stuff all the time and working to make Edge functions really, really useful for everyone and anyone in the world when it's appropriate. So please join me chat in thanking Eduardo for joining us today and answering all those questions. I've learned loads in this half an hour already. Thanks for joining us and have a great time at the rest of Moar Serverless, and see you all soon. Bye.